You should come to the wedding, Emily. It would be nice for you to see how happy Daniel is now. The message had arrived 3 weeks ago on a cream-colored invitation card so thick it almost felt like marble between her fingers. Emily Carter remembered the exact moment she opened it, standing in the quiet kitchen of her small townhouse on the edge of Sacramento, while the afternoon sun spilled across the counter in warm golden stripes. Daniel Brooks was getting married again. The venue printed beneath his name was a vineyard resort in Napa Valley, a place famous for crystal chandeliers, white rose arches, and wedding packages that cost more than most Americans earned in a year. But it wasn't the location that made Emily's stomach tighten. It was the handwriting beneath the printed text. A short sentence written in elegant ink by Daniel's mother. "We thought it would be good for you to come." Emily knew that tone. She had lived with it for 7 years. It wasn't kindness. It was performance. Daniel's family had never liked her. To them, she had always been the wrong choice. The small-town girl who didn't fit into the polished Brooks dynasty of attorneys, investors, and country club board members. When Daniel left her 3 years ago, they hadn't even pretended to be sympathetic. They simply erased her. The divorce had been fast, quiet, and humiliating. 1 week, she was Daniel Brooks' wife. The next, she was a name people avoided mentioning at dinner parties. Emily stared at the invitation for a long time that day, tracing the embossed letters of Daniel's name as if it belonged to someone she once knew, but could barely remember now. Daniel Brooks and Vanessa Hale request the honor of your presence. Vanessa Hale, the woman Daniel had started dating before the divorce papers were even signed. The woman the Brooks family proudly called a much better match. Emily could almost picture the scene they were imagining. She would arrive alone. She would sit quietly in the back row while Daniel married the woman who replaced her. The guests would whisper, pretending not to stare. It would be the perfect ending to a story they had already decided she lost. Emily folded the invitation slowly and placed it on the kitchen table. For a moment the house was completely silent except for the distant hum of traffic on the highway 2 miles away. Then a small voice echoed down the hallway. "Mom." Emily turned toward the sound. 3 small figures appeared at the doorway of the living room, their footsteps light against the hardwood floor. They were identical in a way that still startled strangers. 3 sets of bright blue eyes. 3 messy heads of sandy brown hair. 3 curious little faces watching her expectantly. Her children. Daniel Brooks had no idea they existed. The Brooks family had never asked. Emily looked down at the elegant wedding invitation once more. A slow, thoughtful smile touched the corner of her mouth. "Yes," she said quietly to the empty kitchen. "I think we'll go to the wedding." The drive to Napa Valley took just under 2 hours, but to Emily Carter it felt like a quiet crossing between 2 completely different lives. The Brooks family had chosen the Silver Crest Vineyard Resort, a place where the hills rolled in perfect green waves and the air carried the soft scent of crushed grapes and polished oak barrels. White tents stretched across the lawn like something out of a luxury magazine, and a string quartet played softly near the stone fountain while guests in tailored suits and silk dresses mingled beneath the warm California sun. Emily parked her modest gray sedan at the far end of the lot, away from the rows of black town cars and luxury SUVs. She turned off the engine and sat still for a moment, listening to the faint laughter drifting across the vineyard. In the back seat, 3 small voices whispered to each other with the restless curiosity only children possessed. "Is this the wedding, Mom?" one of them asked. Emily turned around and smiled gently. "Yes, sweetheart. This is the place." The triplets had insisted on wearing their best clothes. 3 tiny navy jackets, 3 white shirts, 3 pairs of neatly pressed khaki pants that Emily had spent nearly an hour ironing the night before. They looked almost identical except for the smallest details, the way Ethan tilted his head when he asked questions, the way Noah held his hands behind his back like he was thinking very carefully, the way little Liam's eyes sparkled whenever he saw something new. Emily stepped out of the car and opened the back door. Warm afternoon sunlight spilled over the children as they climbed down onto the gravel. In the distance, the ceremony arch was already decorated with white roses and pale gold ribbons, and guests were beginning to take their seats in neat rows of ivory chairs. A banner near the entrance displayed the names in elegant calligraphy: Daniel Brooks and Vanessa Hale. Emily felt a familiar tightness in her chest, but it passed quickly. 3 years ago that name would have broken her. Today it felt like a chapter that belonged to someone else. She knelt down to straighten Liam's collar, brushing an invisible piece of lint from his jacket. "Remember what we talked about," she said softly. "Stay close to me, and be polite." "Are we meeting the bride?" Noah asked. Emily paused for just a second before answering. "We are meeting someone important today." As they walked toward the ceremony lawn, a few early guests glanced in their direction. At first the looks were casual, polite curiosity. But then people began to notice the children more carefully. 3 boys walking side by side. The same height, the same bright blue eyes, the same sandy brown hair that caught the sunlight in identical streaks. A woman near the welcome table leaned toward her friend and whispered something behind her hand. Another guest turned his head twice, his expression puzzled. Emily noticed every single reaction, but her face remained calm, almost serene. The Brooks family had imagined this moment very differently. In their minds, she would arrive quietly, embarrassed and alone, the unfortunate ex-wife sitting somewhere in the back row while Daniel began his perfect new life. They had never imagined she would walk in like this. The music from the quartet shifted to a softer melody as ushers began guiding guests toward their seats. Somewhere near the front of the vineyard lawn, Daniel Brooks stood beside the officiant, greeting relatives and shaking hands with old business partners. He looked confident, relaxed, every detail of his dark suit perfectly tailored. The picture of a man whose life had turned out exactly the way he planned. He had not looked toward the parking lot yet. He had not seen the 4 figures walking slowly across the sunlit grass. And Emily knew that in just a few minutes, everything about this beautiful wedding was about to change. Daniel Brooks was laughing at something his best man had just said when the subtle shift in the crowd began. At first it was nothing obvious, just a ripple of quiet murmurs traveling through the rows of ivory chairs like a breeze moving across tall grass. Daniel barely noticed it. Weddings always carried a certain restless energy before the ceremony began. But then one of the ushers turned toward the entrance path and froze for a moment longer than expected. Daniel followed the man's gaze out of casual curiosity. For figures were walking across the vineyard lawn toward the ceremony space. The sunlight behind them made it difficult to see clearly at first, but the shape of the woman's silhouette stirred something faint and uncomfortable in the back of his mind. He narrowed his eyes slightly. As the group moved closer, the murmuring among the guests grew louder. Daniel heard someone whisper a name 2 rows back. "Emily." The sound landed in the air like a dropped glass. Daniel felt a flicker of disbelief. Emily Carter had actually come. His mother had suggested inviting her mostly as a gesture of final closure, a symbolic moment to show that Daniel had moved on to someone better, someone more polished, someone who belonged in their world. None of them truly expected Emily to appear. Daniel straightened slightly, adjusting the cuff of his jacket as he watched her approach. She looked calm, composed, wearing a simple pale blue dress that moved gently in the vineyard breeze. There was nothing dramatic about her entrance. No raised voices. No confrontation. Just quiet footsteps across the trimmed grass. But it was not Emily who held the attention of the entire crowd. It was the 3 small boys walking beside her. They moved together like a reflection repeated 3 times, matching height, matching posture, matching bright blue eyes that caught the sunlight in the exact same way. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. The closer they came, the more impossible it became to ignore the resemblance. The same sandy brown hair, the same sharp chin, the same unmistakable eyes that stared out from Daniel's own childhood photographs. Guests began turning their heads openly now, whispering behind their hands as they studied the children with growing confusion. Even Vanessa Hale, standing near the floral arch with her bridesmaids, noticed the sudden shift in attention. She leaned slightly toward Daniel. "What is everyone looking at?" Daniel did not answer. His gaze was locked on the approaching group as a strange, cold feeling spread through his chest. Emily stopped several yards from the front row. The music from the string quartet faltered slightly before continuing again, softer this time, uncertain. For a moment, the entire vineyard seemed to fall into a fragile silence. One of the boys tugged gently on Emily's hand and looked up at her. "Mom," the child asked in a clear, innocent voice that carried easily through the quiet air, "is that him?" Emily looked toward Daniel. Their eyes met for the first time in 3 years. Daniel expected anger, bitterness, something sharp or emotional. Instead, he saw only calm certainty in her expression. Emily rested a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder before taking a few slow steps forward. Guests leaned forward in their chairs. The vineyard breeze rustled softly through the white rose decorations above the aisle. Daniel felt the world narrow to the distance between them as Emily finally stopped at the front row of seats. She looked directly at him and spoke in a steady voice that carried clearly across the ceremony lawn. "Daniel," she said quietly, "I think it is time you meet your sons." For several seconds no one moved. The words seemed to hang in the warm Napa Valley air like a bell that had been struck but had not finished echoing. Daniel Brooks stared at Emily as if the ground beneath the vineyard had suddenly shifted. "Your sons." The phrase repeated inside his mind with a heavy, disorienting weight. Daniel's eyes moved slowly from Emily to the three boys standing beside her. Now that they were only a few yards away, the resemblance was impossible to ignore. The same blue eyes that Daniel had inherited from his father. The same stubborn line of the jaw. Even the way the smallest boy tilted his head while studying the crowd looked painfully familiar. Daniel opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Around them, the quiet murmurs of the guests grew louder, spreading through the rows of chairs like wind across dry leaves. Several people exchanged stunned looks. Others leaned closer together, whispering questions that no one could yet answer. Near the floral arch, Vanessa Hale stood frozen, her smile slowly fading as she watched the scene unfold. "Daniel," she said quietly, her voice tight with confusion, "what is she talking about?" But Daniel did not look at her. His attention remained locked on the children. One of the boys stepped half a pace forward, curiosity shining openly across his face. "Mom," he said again in that clear voice, "is this our dad?" The question landed gently but carried across the silent ceremony space with startling clarity. Emily placed a calm hand on the boy's shoulder. "Yes," she said softly, never taking her eyes off Daniel. "This is your father." The boy studied Daniel carefully, as though examining a puzzle piece that had finally appeared after years of waiting. Behind him, his two brothers shifted slightly, looking between their mother and the man standing beside the wedding arch. Daniel felt his heartbeat begin to thrum loudly in his ears. Memories surfaced in flashes he could not stop. The last argument before the divorce. Emily standing in the doorway of their old house with tears in her eyes. The way she had tried to speak while he rushed through the explanation that their marriage simply was not working anymore. At the time, Daniel had convinced himself it was the right decision. The practical decision. Vanessa had been exciting, ambitious, someone who matched the polished world his family expected him to inhabit. Emily had seemed quiet, too simple for the life he believed he was meant to build. Now that certainty felt strangely hollow. Daniel took a slow step forward from the altar area, his polished shoes pressing softly into the vineyard grass. The guests watched him with the same breathless attention usually reserved for the exchange of wedding vows. He stopped several feet away from Emily and the children, his expression struggling between disbelief and something far deeper. "Emily," he said slowly, his voice rough with confusion, "what are you saying?" Emily's expression remained composed, almost peaceful, as if she had carried this moment carefully for years. "I am saying that 3 years ago," she replied gently. "When you decided our marriage was finished, I had just learned that I was pregnant." A sharp ripple of surprise passed through the crowd. Daniel felt as though the air had been pulled from his lungs. Emily continued, her voice calm but unwavering. "Not with one child," she said quietly. "With 3. The 3 boys stood patiently beside her, their small hands folded in front of their neatly pressed jackets. The vineyard breeze stirred their hair in identical waves. Daniel looked at them again, and this time the recognition struck him fully. These were not strangers. These were pieces of a life he had walked away from without ever realizing what he had left behind. The silence that followed Emily's words felt heavier than the warm California air hanging over the vineyard. For a long moment, Daniel Brooks simply stood there, staring at the 3 boys as though he were trying to wake from a dream that had suddenly turned unfamiliar. Around him, the elegant wedding ceremony had frozen in place. The officiant stood quietly beside the rose-covered arch. The string quartet had stopped playing altogether. Even the servers carrying trays of champagne had paused along the edges of the lawn, unsure whether the celebration they were hired for still existed. Daniel slowly ran a hand across his forehead, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were pregnant, and you never told me?" Emily did not flinch. "I tried," she said calmly. "You remember that night before the divorce papers were finalized? I asked if we could talk, but you said everything important had already been decided." Daniel remembered it now with painful clarity. The conversation had lasted less than 5 minutes. He had been in a hurry, eager to move forward with the new life he believed was waiting for him. At the time, he had convinced himself that Emily was simply struggling to accept the end of their marriage. He had never imagined there was something more she had wanted to say. Emily continued speaking, her voice steady but filled with quiet truth. "When I discovered I was expecting, I thought you deserved to know. But by then your family's lawyers were already pushing the settlement papers, and every message I sent was returned with silence. After a while I understood something very clearly. You had already walked away." Several guests exchanged uneasy glances. Daniel's mother, seated in the second row, shifted uncomfortably in her chair as the weight of Emily's words settled over the ceremony lawn. Daniel's gaze moved back to the boys. Ethan, Noah, and Liam stood patiently beside their mother, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope. They were too young to understand the complicated history unfolding in front of them. To them, this was simply the first time they were meeting their father. The smallest of the three boys stepped forward again, studying Daniel carefully as if measuring whether he looked like the man he had imagined. "Mom said you used to live with us before we were born," the child said innocently. "Is that true?" Daniel felt his throat tighten. He crouched slightly so that his eyes were level with the boys. Up close, the resemblance struck him even harder. It was like looking into 3 tiny mirrors reflecting a younger version of himself. "Yes," he said quietly. "That is true." Behind him, Vanessa's voice finally broke the stunned quiet. "Daniel," she said, her tone strained with disbelief. "What exactly is happening right now?" Daniel slowly stood again, but did not turn toward the wedding arch. Instead, he kept looking at Emily. For the first time since she arrived, his expression had changed. The confident certainty he had worn all morning had disappeared, replaced by something far more complicated. Regret, confusion, and the dawning realization that the life he thought he had left behind was standing only a few feet away from him in the form of 3 small boys who carried his eyes, his features, and a future he had never known existed. Vanessa Hale's question hung sharply in the air, but Daniel Brooks did not answer it immediately. His attention remained fixed on the 3 boys standing beside Emily, as though the rest of the vineyard had faded into the background. The sunlight caught their hair in the same warm shade of brown that Daniel had seen in old photographs of himself as a child. It was unsettling and undeniable all at once. Guests shifted quietly in their chairs, their earlier excitement for the ceremony now replaced by a deep curiosity that no one attempted to hide. Daniel's mother rose slowly from the second row, her expression tight with discomfort as she looked from Emily to the children. "Emily," she said carefully, as though choosing every word with precision, "this is an extremely inappropriate time for revelations." Emily met her gaze without hostility, but without apology either. "I agree," she replied calmly. "It is not the moment your family expected, but it is the moment that exists." The quiet certainty in her voice made several guests glance at one another again. Daniel felt the weight of every eye on the vineyard lawn pressing toward him. 3 years ago, he had been completely certain of the path he was choosing. He had convinced himself that leaving Emily behind was a necessary step toward a more successful life, the kind of life his family had always believed he deserved. Now that decision stood before him in the form of 3 small boys who were watching him with hopeful curiosity. Ethan shifted his weight slightly and spoke again in a polite voice that carried easily across the silent lawn. "Mom says you work in a big office in the city," he said. "Do you like your job?" The simple question struck Daniel with surprising force. He had spent years discussing business deals, investment strategies, and corporate partnerships. Yet this small child was asking something far more basic. Daniel crouched again, lowering himself so that he was closer to their height. "Yes," he said gently. "I do like my job." Noah tilted his head thoughtfully. "Do you live far away?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "About an hour from here." The 3 boys exchanged quick glances with one another, as though silently evaluating this information. Their curiosity felt natural and open, completely untouched by the complicated emotions filling the vineyard. Emily watched quietly as the exchange unfolded. She had imagined this moment many times over the past 3 years, but the reality felt calmer than she had expected. There was no shouting, no dramatic accusations. Just truth standing plainly in the sunlight. Behind Daniel, Vanessa finally stepped forward from the arch, her elegant white dress moving carefully over the grass. Her voice remained composed, but there was a sharp tension beneath it. "Daniel," she said slowly, "we have 200 guests waiting for a wedding ceremony." Daniel stood up again, but did not return to the arch. Instead, he looked toward the rows of guests who were now watching with complete attention. The celebration that had been planned for months no longer felt certain. His gaze returned once more to the boys. They stood patiently beside Emily, their identical blue eyes reflecting a quiet expectation he could not ignore. For the first time since the ceremony began, Daniel realized something with painful clarity. The most important moment of the day might not be the vows waiting at the altar, but the 3 small lives standing only a few steps away from him, representing a future he had never known he was meant to face. The vineyard remained suspended in a strange stillness, as though the entire afternoon had paused to witness what would happen next. Daniel Brooks stood between 2 futures that only minutes earlier had seemed perfectly clear. On one side waited the wedding arch draped in white roses, the guests, the photographers, the carefully planned ceremony that promised a flawless beginning to a new chapter. On the other side stood Emily Carter and the 3 boys who carried his eyes, his smile, and a truth he had never expected to face. The breeze moved gently through the vineyard rows beyond the ceremony lawn, carrying the distant scent of grapes and sun-warmed earth. Ethan broke the silence first. "Mom says we like baseball," he said politely, looking up at Daniel with open curiosity. "Do you like baseball too?" The simplicity of the question cut through the tension like sunlight through glass. Daniel blinked once, clearly surprised by the sudden shift from the heavy conversation of adults to the natural curiosity of children. "Yes," he said slowly. "I used to play when I was younger." Liam's face brightened instantly. "I have a glove," he said proudly. "Mom got it for my birthday." Noah glanced toward the ceremony arch, where Vanessa still stood waiting in her white dress, then back to Daniel. "Are you getting married right now?" he asked with the straightforward honesty only a child could have. Several guests shifted awkwardly at the question, but Daniel did not look away from the boys. He realized suddenly that they were not judging him. They were not angry or resentful. They were simply trying to understand who he was. Daniel drew a slow breath, then looked toward Emily. For the first time since she arrived, there was no tension in her posture. She was not demanding anything. She was not asking for apologies or explanations. She had simply brought the truth into the open and allowed it to stand where everyone could see it. Daniel felt something inside him shift quietly. For years he had believed success meant control, planning, and moving forward without hesitation. But standing there now, he understood that some moments demanded something else entirely. Honesty, responsibility, and the courage to face what he had once walked away from. Behind him, Vanessa took another careful step forward. "Daniel," she said again, this time more firmly, "the ceremony cannot wait forever." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as though weighing the full meaning of her words. When he opened them again, he looked down at the 3 boys who were watching him with patient expectation. They had no idea that their presence had just changed the course of an entire day. Ethan adjusted the sleeve of his small jacket and said quietly, "Mom told us we might meet you someday." Daniel felt the weight of that sentence settle deep in his chest. Someday. The word carried 3 years of missed birthdays, first steps, and bedtime stories he had never known about. Slowly, Daniel straightened and looked out across the sea of guests who had gathered to witness his wedding. Their expressions were no longer those of excited spectators. Now they looked like people witnessing something far more real than a ceremony. Daniel turned back to Emily and the boys. The decision forming inside him was not dramatic, but it was unmistakably clear. And for the first time since the afternoon began, Daniel Brooks understood that the life he thought he had planned might not be the life that truly mattered. Daniel Brooks stood quietly for several seconds after the boys spoke, the sound of their voices lingering in the warm afternoon air. Around him the vineyard remained still, the rows of guests watching with an attention that felt far deeper than simple curiosity. Weddings were meant to follow a script. Music would rise, Vows would be exchanged, rings would be placed on waiting fingers. But the moment unfolding now had rewritten that script entirely. Daniel looked again at Ethan, Noah, and Liam. The boys were studying him openly, without fear or resentment, as though they were simply trying to understand the man who shared their eyes. Daniel felt a strange mixture of warmth and regret settle into his chest. For years he had believed that success meant moving forward without looking back, but the quiet presence of these three small boys reminded him that some parts of life were never meant to be left behind. Behind him, Vanessa's patience finally thinned. Her voice, though controlled, carried across the ceremony lawn with unmistakable tension. "Daniel," she said carefully, "everyone is waiting." Daniel turned slowly toward the arch where she stood in her white dress, the afternoon sunlight catching the delicate lace along her sleeves. Just an hour earlier, the entire day had revolved around that moment, the promise of a future he had carefully planned. But now the scene looked different, as though the arch itself belonged to a story that no longer fit the moment. Daniel took a breath and glanced briefly toward the rows of guests. Some watched him with open curiosity, others with thoughtful silence. A few members of his own family looked deeply uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as the situation continued to unfold. Then Daniel looked back at Emily. She had not moved. She simply stood beside the boys, her posture calm, her expression steady. She was not asking him for anything. She was only giving him the chance to see the truth that had been hidden from him for 3 years. Daniel stepped away from the arch. The movement was small, but it carried across the lawn like the first note of a new song. Vanessa's expression tightened as she watched him walk past the first row of chairs toward Emily and the boys. The guests followed every step with quiet fascination. When Daniel reached them, he paused and looked down at the children again. Ethan held his baseball cap in both hands. Noah watched Daniel with thoughtful curiosity. Liam smiled shyly, as though hoping this stranger might turn out to be someone important in his life. Daniel crouched once more so that he was eye level with them. His voice was softer now, stripped of the confidence he had worn earlier in the day. "I should have known," he said quietly. The boys looked at one another, unsure what the words meant. Daniel continued, choosing his words carefully. "If I had listened more carefully 3 years ago, I would have understood that something important was waiting for me." Emily did not interrupt him. She simply watched as the moment unfolded naturally. Daniel looked up at her briefly. There was no accusation in his expression, only the realization of how much time had passed without his knowledge. Then he turned back to the boys. "Would it be all right if I talked with you for a little while?" he asked gently. Ethan nodded first, followed by Noah and Liam. The three of them moved a small step closer, their curiosity overcoming the uncertainty of the moment. Across the vineyard lawn, the guests watched as the carefully planned ceremony slowly transformed into something far more real. It was no longer a wedding defined by flowers and music. It had become a moment of truth, where the past and the future stood face to face under the California sun. The three boys moved a little closer to Daniel, as if the invisible distance between them had begun to shrink. The vineyard lawn remained filled with quiet watchers, but the world now seemed smaller, centered around the simple circle formed by Emily, the children, and the man who had just discovered the truth of his own family. Daniel rested one hand gently on his knee as he looked at them more carefully, noticing details he had not seen before. Ethan's thoughtful expression, Noah's calm curiosity, Liam's bright, hopeful smile. Each one carried something unmistakably familiar. It was not only their eyes. It was the way they stood, the quiet confidence in their posture. Even the way Liam tapped the toe of his shoe against the grass exactly the way Daniel used to do when he was nervous as a boy. Ethan spoke first, his voice polite but filled with the natural curiosity of a child who had waited a long time for an answer. "Mom told us you did not know about us," he said. Daniel nodded slowly. "That is true," he replied gently. "I did not know, but I wish I had." Noah folded his hands behind his back, studying Daniel with thoughtful seriousness. "Are you surprised?" he asked. Daniel allowed a small, honest smile. "Yes, very surprised." The boys exchanged quick glances with one another, as if silently discussing his answer. Liam stepped slightly closer. "Mom says surprises can be good sometimes," he said. Daniel felt something warm settle quietly inside his chest at the simple statement. "Your mom is right about that," he said softly. Behind them, the wedding guests continued watching, but the energy in the crowd had changed. Earlier, there had been curiosity, even a hint of gossip in the air. Now many faces showed something different. Understanding. Reflection. Some guests even smiled gently at the children, as though recognizing that this moment carried more meaning than any carefully planned ceremony. Near the arch, Vanessa remained standing with her bridesmaids, her expression difficult to read. The white roses behind her moved slightly in the breeze, but she did not step forward again. Daniel knew that the life he had planned only hours earlier had quietly shifted course. Yet standing here with the boys, he felt no panic. Only a deep awareness that the path in front of him now required honesty instead of certainty. Daniel looked up at Emily again. "How old are they?" he asked quietly. "They turned 3 last month," Emily replied. Daniel absorbed the number slowly. 3 years. 3 birthdays he had never celebrated. 3 years of first words, first steps, and bedtime stories that had happened without him even knowing they existed. The realization settled heavily, but it also carried a strange clarity. Ethan looked up at Daniel with a thoughtful expression. "Do you live near a park?" he asked. Daniel blinked, surprised by the sudden change in subject. "Yes," he said after a moment. "There is a park near my apartment." Ethan nodded as if confirming an important detail. "Mom takes us to the park every Saturday," he said. Liam's face brightened immediately. "They have a big slide," he added excitedly. Daniel chuckled softly, the sound easing some of the tension that had filled the afternoon. "I know that park," he said. "The slide is very tall." Noah tilted his head. "Have you ever gone down it?" Daniel shook his head with a small laugh. "No, but maybe I should try it someday." The boys grinned at the idea. Around them, the vineyard ceremony space no longer felt like a wedding waiting to begin. Instead, it had become the setting for something far more important. A father meeting his children for the very first time, under the quiet California sun, while the future slowly began to reshape itself around the truth that had finally been spoken. The quiet laughter of the 3 boys lingered in the warm afternoon air, soft and genuine in a place that only an hour earlier had been prepared for a carefully orchestrated celebration. Daniel Brooks remained crouched in front of them, listening as Ethan explained the rules of the baseball game they played in the park every Saturday morning. The small details of their lives unfolded naturally, each sentence revealing moments Daniel had never known existed. Liam described how Noah always tried to climb the tallest slide first. Noah explained that Ethan was the fastest runner during their games of tag. The stories were simple, but each one carried a quiet reminder of the years Daniel had missed. Daniel listened closely, his expression thoughtful rather than overwhelmed. There was regret in his eyes, but also a growing determination that had not been there earlier in the day. Across the vineyard lawn, the rows of guests had begun to relax into their chairs, their attention no longer focused on the idea of a wedding ceremony, but on the rare honesty unfolding in front of them. Some guests whispered quietly. Others watched in silence, recognizing that something far more meaningful than a scheduled event was taking place. Emily stood beside the boys, her hands resting loosely at her sides. She had not interrupted the conversation once. She simply allowed the moment to happen, knowing that the truth had already done its work. After a few minutes, Daniel slowly stood up again. The movement drew the attention of the guests, who seemed to sense that another decision was approaching. Daniel looked down at Ethan, Noah, and Liam once more before turning slightly toward Emily. "Thank you for bringing them here," he said quietly. Emily studied him for a moment, measuring the sincerity in his voice. "They deserve to meet you," she replied simply. Daniel nodded, accepting the weight of those words. He turned then toward the ceremony arch where Vanessa still waited beside the officiant. The white roses above the arch moved gently in the breeze, their soft petals catching the sunlight. For a brief moment, the vineyard returned to the image it had been earlier that afternoon, a perfect setting for a wedding. But Daniel understood now that the meaning of the day had changed. He walked slowly toward the arch, each step steady and deliberate. The guests followed him with their eyes as he approached Vanessa. When he stopped in front of her, the quiet between them held the tension of everything that had happened. Vanessa's voice remained calm, but her expression carried a clear question. "Daniel," she said softly, "are we still getting married today?" Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked back across the lawn toward the place where Emily stood with the boys. Ethan was pointing toward the vineyard hills in the distance. Liam was laughing about something Noah had said. The scene was simple and peaceful, yet it held a truth that Daniel could not ignore. He turned back to Vanessa, his voice steady and respectful. "I need time," he said. The words were not dramatic, but they carried unmistakable finality. A ripple of quiet understanding moved through the guests. Daniel stepped back from the arch and turned again toward Emily and the boys. The life he had expected to begin that afternoon had quietly faded. In its place stood something unexpected, uncertain, and far more important. And for the first time that day, Daniel Brooks walked toward it willingly. The moment Daniel stepped away from the wedding arch, a quiet understanding spread across the vineyard like a ripple across still water. The string quartet remained silent, their instruments resting loosely in their hands as the musicians watched the unexpected turn of events unfold. Guests exchanged glances, some surprised, others thoughtful, but none of them looked away. It was no longer the kind of afternoon anyone had expected, yet somehow the atmosphere felt more honest than the carefully rehearsed celebration that had been planned. Daniel walked slowly back across the grass toward Emily and the three boys. Each step felt deliberate, as if he were leaving behind one version of his life and moving toward another that he had only just discovered. Ethan noticed him first. "He is coming back," the boy said quietly to his brothers. Liam grinned as if this was the most natural outcome in the world. Noah simply watched with the same thoughtful expression he had carried all afternoon. When Daniel reached them again, he paused for a moment, looking down at the boys with a mixture of warmth and reflection. "Do you like ice cream?" he asked suddenly. The question caught them by surprise, but their reactions were immediate. Liam's eyes lit up with excitement. "Chocolate," he announced proudly. Ethan nodded with a serious expression. "Strawberry." Noah considered the question carefully before answering. "Vanilla with sprinkles." Daniel laughed softly, the sound easing the weight that had filled his chest earlier. "Those are excellent choices," he said. Emily watched the exchange quietly, recognizing the careful way Daniel was trying to bridge the unfamiliar space between them. After a moment, he looked up at her again. "I know this does not change the years that have already passed," he said, "but I would like the chance to know them." Emily studied his face carefully. The confidence that had once defined Daniel Brooks had softened into something more grounded, more sincere. For the first time in years, he was not speaking like a man who believed everything could be controlled. He was speaking like someone who understood that some things had to be earned. "That will depend on what you choose to do next," Emily replied calmly. Daniel nodded slowly. "Then I will start with something simple," he said. He looked down at the boys again. "Would you like to visit that park you told me about?" Liam clapped his hands together excitedly. "The one with the tall slide," he said. Ethan looked toward Emily for permission. She gave a small nod, and the boys immediately began talking about the games they liked to play there. Across the vineyard lawn the guests began to relax, some standing from their chairs, others quietly gathering their belongings. The planned ceremony had dissolved, but in its place a different kind of moment had taken shape. One defined not by vows spoken at an altar, but by the quiet recognition of responsibility and possibility. Daniel glanced once more toward the empty wedding arch, the white roses moving gently in the breeze. Then he turned fully toward Emily and the boys, understanding that the path ahead would not be simple or immediate. But it was real, and for the first time in a long while, Daniel Brooks was ready to walk it. The vineyard slowly began to empty as the afternoon sunlight softened into a warm golden glow across the rolling hills. Guests who had arrived expecting a flawless wedding now walked quietly along the gravel paths, speaking in low voices about the extraordinary moment they had just witnessed. Some paused near the rows of grapevines, glancing back toward the ceremony lawn where the white chairs still stood neatly arranged, untouched by vows that would never be spoken that day. At the center of it all, Emily remained standing beside the boys while Daniel knelt again on the grass, listening as Liam enthusiastically described the tall slide at their favorite park. "It is really fast," Liam explained with wide eyes. "You have to hold on with both hands." Daniel smiled gently. "That sounds like good advice," he said. Ethan pointed toward the vineyard road where a small ice cream truck had just appeared in the distance, its bright colors moving slowly along the narrow lane. "Look," Ethan said, excitement rising in his voice. "Ice cream." Noah nodded thoughtfully, as if confirming that the day was turning out better than expected. Daniel followed their gaze and chuckled softly. "Well," he said, standing up and brushing a bit of grass from his jacket. "That seems like perfect timing." The boys looked toward Emily, waiting for her approval. She studied Daniel for a moment, noticing the quiet determination in his posture. He was not pretending the past could be erased. Instead, he seemed ready to begin somewhere simple and honest. Emily gave a small nod. "All right," she said. "Ice cream it is." Liam cheered quietly, while Ethan and Noah began discussing which flavor they would choose. Daniel walked with them toward the gravel path, the boys naturally gathering around him as if they had known him longer than a few minutes. Their small voices filled the warm air with questions about baseball, parks, and whether Daniel knew how to build a kite. He answered each question patiently, listening as carefully as he spoke. Behind them, the wedding arch still stood covered in white roses, but its meaning had faded into the background. The real moment of the day had already taken place beneath the open sky. As they reached the path, Daniel slowed slightly and looked toward Emily. "I know today changed everything," he said quietly, "and I know trust takes time. But I will not disappear again." Emily met his gaze with calm honesty. "They deserve consistency," she replied. Daniel nodded. "Then that is where I will start." The boys had already reached the small ice cream truck and were examining the colorful menu painted along its side. Liam pointed excitedly at the pictures while Noah tried to read the flavors aloud. Ethan turned back briefly to see if Daniel was still following. Daniel stepped forward beside them without hesitation. The late afternoon sunlight stretched long shadows across the vineyard road as the four figures stood together for the first time, not as strangers, but as the beginning of something new. And as the boys laughed over their choices of chocolate, strawberry, and vanilla with sprinkles, the quiet realization settled gently into the California air that sometimes the most important promises in life were not spoken at an altar, but proven through the simple decision to stay. The small ice cream truck's cheerful bell echoed softly along the vineyard road as the boys stood in front of the painted menu, debating their choices with the kind of seriousness only children could bring to dessert. Liam pointed excitedly at the picture of chocolate. Swirl while Noah studied the list of flavors as though he were solving an important puzzle. Ethan glanced between the options, then looked up at Daniel with a thoughtful smile. Daniel stood beside them, holding a few dollar bills the vendor had just handed back as change, watching the boys with quiet attention. Only an hour earlier, he had been preparing to exchange wedding vows in front of hundreds of guests. Now he was standing beside three children he had only just met, listening to them argue gently about whether sprinkles were better than gummy bears. And strangely, it felt more real than anything he had planned that morning. Emily leaned lightly against the wooden fence beside the road, observing the moment with calm eyes. The late afternoon sun painted the vineyard hills in warm shades of gold and amber, and the breeze carried the distant scent of ripe grapes. She had imagined many endings to the chapter that once connected her life with Daniel's. None of those imagined endings had looked like this. Daniel handed the boys their cones carefully, making sure each one held it firmly before stepping back. Liam immediately took a delighted bite, leaving a small smudge of chocolate on the corner of his mouth. Noah inspected his vanilla cone with sprinkles like a scientist analyzing an experiment. Ethan thanked the vendor politely before turning back toward Daniel. "This is the best surprise," Liam declared between bites. Daniel laughed quietly. "I'm glad you think so." The boys began walking slowly down the vineyard path, their small footsteps crunching softly on the gravel as they talked about the tall slide at the park again. Daniel followed beside them, occasionally answering another question or pointing out something interesting in the distance. After a few steps, he slowed and looked toward Emily, who had begun walking beside them again. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The years between them were still real, still complicated, but something new had started to grow in the quiet space where anger once lived. Daniel finally broke the silence. "I cannot change the past," he said gently, "but I can choose what happens next." Emily looked at the boys ahead of them as they laughed together under the fading sunlight. "They will remember what you do from now on," she said calmly. Daniel nodded, understanding the meaning beneath her words. Ahead of them, Liam suddenly turned and waved excitedly. "Come on," he called. "We are going to see the grape fields." Daniel smiled and quickened his pace to catch up with them. As the four figures moved down the vineyard road together, the last of the wedding guests quietly departed behind them, leaving the empty white chairs and silent arch beneath the evening sky. The celebration that had once been planned there would never happen. But something else had begun instead, something quieter and far more powerful. Because the truth was simple. Daniel Brooks had invited the past to disappear forever. But when it arrived that afternoon holding 3 small hands, he finally understood that the most important future of his life had been waiting for him all along.